This is the Migration Story podcast. We welcome you to a very informative and fun episode that has the Migration Story founder Roli Srivastav in conversation with climate scientist Dr. Anjan Ray about extreme weather events, India's renewable energy growth, and what this means for some of the country's poorest.
Hi, I'm a climate journalist and founder of the Migration Story. I have been doing ground reports on India's energy transition from the lens of local communities, of people who live near energy projects. What do these energy projects mean to them? What do they gain from these massive solar and wind projects coming up in their backyard? I have wondered if there can be a balance between climate mitigation and protecting livelihoods, the many complexities of it all in a country like India. I'm really excited to have climate scientist Dr. Anjan Ray on this podcast to help us understand and unpack India's push for clean energy. Dr. Ray helmed the Indian Institute of Petroleum, a constituent laboratory of the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, until last year when he retired. And on this podcast, we will discuss the rather rarely explored climate community angle. Welcome to the Migration Story podcast, Dr. Ray. I'm so glad you could make the time for this conversation.
It's a pleasure to be here, Roli. I love what you folks are doing at the Migration Story, drawing attention to a large vulnerable population below the radar who are living on the fringes of development. It's almost like there are two Indias, an India of settled people who are looking forward to a Viksit Bharat, and an India of people who don't yet know where they belong.
That's so well put, Dr. Ray. It's so aligned to exactly what we are trying to do at the Migration Story. But I must tell our viewers, our listeners, one a bit of history that we share. One is, of course, you were my teacher at the Xavier Institute of Communications many years ago, and I truly enjoyed your sessions and we looked forward to your class. But there's another one that I'm very jealous of you because you lived in Dehradun in your last posting, and that's the town of my childhood memories. But now that you've shifted to Delhi, I really have no complaints.
Well, this is a deep sigh kind of moment. I didn't just live in Dehradun. I lived in one of the prettiest natural campuses of Dehradun, probably of India. It's called the CSIR, Indian Institute of Petroleum, and it was in the buffer zone of the Lachiwala range of Rajaji National Park. On an evening walk, I would get a leopard. I've seen a python eat a baby nilgai. I've had a snake bite and all the other fun that one has in a place like that. I used to climb trees for fun. So in spite of all its forest cover, Delhi can't compare. That's just life.
Climbing trees. Oh, how lovely. And speaking of Delhi, and of course Delhi has a green cover, but of course this year has been particularly harsh. Delhi recorded one of the worst heat waves ever this year, and we did stories from the city on the impact these heat waves had on the poorest living in the city. But talking about these extreme weather events also brings us to climate solutions, which is the focus of this podcast. India is building its clean energy capacity, aiming at 500 gigawatt by 2030. What's your opinion about India's strategy to meet this target?
I have been active in the clean energy space now for probably close to 20 years, a little more in fact. And India's done rather well. I remember in 2007, when at that time Mr. Shamsaran, he was the secretary for one of the government departments, and he said that India should have extensive solar coverage. And it was met with a degree of disbelief because the price of solar power then was 16 rupees a unit and the price of coal power was 350. And today, coal power prices have got pushed down and old biomass and coal plants are getting shut because solar power is down below 3. And that's what a concerted plan does. So let's say from 2014, we had 2.8 gigawatts of solar power. Now we have 85. We have 67 gigawatts of ground-mounted solar plants, 13 gigawatts of grid-connected rooftops, and all sorts of other things that have happened, plus a big amount of wind, right? 47 gigawatts of wind, small hydro, large hydro. Hydro's been around for a long time. And we have biopower, right? a lot of the agricultural waste that gets bad press for being burnt would have been much worse if it weren't for the fact that the country has cogeneration and all the sugar mill waste is burnt in the sugar mills to produce power and steam. So the only thing is that while the policies have been good, industrial growth has been great, geopolitics has been favorable, we have urbanized so it's easier to do centralized power and rooftop solar, but installed generation capacity of solar doesn't tell us the full story. Because renewable power is not 24/7. When you run a coal power plant or a natural gas power plant, it's all the time. But a solar plant is only producing when the sun is shining. A wind plant is only producing when the wind is blowing. And with the exception of biopower and geothermal, actual generation is probably 30% of those installed capacity numbers that you see. So another thing that happens is that because we were used to building big centralized plants for coal and gas and hydro, we kept thinking big is beautiful. But actually, big plants also have a large environmental footprint, and that is sometimes missed in the public narrative. The environmental footprint is not only about, let's say, displacement with a Tehri Dam or a Sardar Sarovar project. It is also big because it causes wildlife, animal, human conflicts. When you displace wildlife, their corridors shift. And having lived with leopards close by, I know that if you don't give a leopard its corridor, you can have unpleasant things potentially happen. And apart from the displacement and the conflict issues, we have to also remember that wind and solar are not, the plants are not perennial. They will have a life, 20 years, 25 years, whatever. What happens to those panels and blades when they go? That's still a big problem, and it is better we solve them before we have to be forced to solve them. So you mentioned about Delhi's heat wave too. Now that's not unusual. I've grown up in Delhi, it was always hot, but it was never so hot that you started talking about 50-degree numbers. And every year the peak temperatures are getting a little bit worse, but the night temperatures are even worse. Now there are times when the night temperature doesn't drop below 30, and that's partly the urban heat island effect, but it's partly because we're building unsustainable cities. The way we build our buildings, the building materials we use, the spacing between buildings, the groundwater levels having dropped, all of these are adding to urban heat. And then poor building design, rampant groundwater extraction, and the increasing vehicle and air conditioning loads on the city. These are all part of the horribly hot that you just described. I must say though, you live in Bombay, I think, right?
Yes.
So Delhi has a hot season. Bombay has only 3 seasons, hot, wet and horrible.
Yeah. Okay, back to the clean energy focus. But I'm glad you kind of showed us the future about why we need to plan for the future of these clean energy projects. What will we do with these panels? What will we do with this entire infrastructure that we are creating? And we need to find the solutions now. But similarly, we also need to find solutions of the local communities living near these clean energy projects, because in recent years, there has been considerable reportage on the impact of big clean energy projects on people, the local villages that are around them. There are reports on projects coming up on land traditionally used for grazing, or projects not creating as many employment opportunities for locals. That's for lack of education or the skills that are needed on these plants. So do you think the renewable energy sector could be more mindful of these challenges and possibly more inclusive?
So the point that you raised here, a very important one, about the renewable energy sector being more mindful of the human angle. This is a direct connect with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which were reframed in 2015 after the Millennium Development Goals of 2000 were seen to be inadequate. And by focusing on just development and not inclusive development down to the bottom of the pyramid, a few things had been missed that the SDGs aimed to correct. So in this, when we talk about climate action, let's say, or renewable energy, which are goals number 7 and 13, we should also remember that goal number 1 is zero poverty and goal number 2 is zero hunger. So, really, the first thing to do when you have a large project is not only look at the environmental impact analysis, which is mandated, but also the social impact analysis. The point you made about people not getting as many jobs, that's not going to change, because it's also a natural resistance and reluctance of those who have never studied or done work. Their traditional livelihoods are different from what a renewable energy plant can give them. Also, with increasing automation and AI, the number of people per unit megawatt is going to drop, and that's a reality. What you really need, first of all, are smaller projects, more decentralized, so that you're impacting less people in one place at one time. And we've seen that in hydro. There has been a distinct shift away from large to small hydro in this country. We are also seeing it to an extent in biopower. We are seeing a resurgence in small biogas plants. But you have to remember that at the moment, people are still highly married to this concept of economy of scale. If I build big, it is cheaper. And that will change only when a climate tax comes in or a carbon tax comes in, because bigger projects will start becoming climate unviable. There is also an issue that there are multiple policy, regulatory, and operational challenges here, because you have a state government, you have a central government, and you'll have a local body. It could be a panchayat or an urban local body. And they're not necessarily speaking to each other or on the same language. The person at the urban local body sees what happens at the grassroots, but may not be fully empowered to address it. And the large policy decisions are getting done at the center, while land is a state subject, so the state is granting the land. So unless you have a deep stakeholder connect, it's not so easy. A bureaucrat sitting far away in Delhi authorizing a decision somewhere down in Karnataka doesn't really have a ground touch. Another thing is that the policy incentives and priorities and market mechanisms for renewable energy projects are largely at the state level. So if a state wants investment, it will give incentives. In the process of giving incentives, it is not putting obligations on social engineering or obligations on long-term environmental management of the peripheral ecosystems. So grazing land area is one example that you raised. Biodiversity itself is changing. So if I look at the Great Indian Bustard, its habitat has shrunk because of overhead power lines. If I go today to Bhavnagar, I cry every time I go on that road from Ahmedabad to Bhavnagar, because invasive tree species, there's one called Prosopis juliflora, it's called Vilayati kikar, that is everywhere. It's a thorny tree. Cattle and goats can't really graze on it. It's hostile for nesting of birds. And as the bird population drops, your butterflies and bees, which are managed by the bird population, or caterpillars that are eaten, go rampant. So there's a shift in the balance of power. And you will find in some places you have pests eating crops because of that. And then you use more pesticides. Everything is interconnected. In the meanwhile, because you are not able to manage the pests, you're not able to ensure or understand the connect between large projects of any sort. Doesn't have to be renewable only. It could be large housing projects or anything else. Unless you look at the whole picture, you start impacting crops. And if you impact crop productivity, eventually the farmer, the marginal farmer, who is anyway becoming marginal with every generation because his land holding is shrinking as it's divided among families, the marginal farmer is eventually pushed into migration. So there's a very, very complex ecosystem at play here. Rampant sand mining of riverbeds affects those who camp on floodplains. The extreme weather events in the east coast, the Sundarbans, Orissa, are creating more migrants. And in fact, it is forecast that there will be 45 million more migrants in India by 2050. So if we can't look after our migrants now, how will I look after our migrants then?
That sounds like it's both complex and grim and everything at the same time. But do you think that we still have the time? Do you think we are still in a space where RE projects can be reimagined, can be planned and implemented in a manner that some of these challenges that you kind of shared just now could possibly be met?
I'm kind of an eternal optimist. I think that there's a lot that can be done, but there's also quite a few things that are being done, and putting them into a framework like the SDGs and having a national indicator framework that India has put in place. So this is little known, but I actually find it quite effective, especially when I'm going out for talks or I'm looking for data. The Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation has worked with the Niti Aayog to build a dashboard, and it actually shows you how different states are rated, how different districts are rated in terms of the SDGs. You can actually go down and look really deep, and I would encourage you to do that, because sometimes you can use those as buttons to push local administration or even national consciousness. And in the SDGs, particularly there's an SDG 17 called Partnership for the Goals, which indicates that all the SDGs are interdependent and continuous stakeholder dialogue is needed. I like the fact that, for example, now we see a lot more of draft bills coming up for consultation. Yeah. Mm-hmm. There have been times in our history when bills have happened and the public didn't know what it was. But now there's an internet. Now there are people like you, there are think tanks, there are independent researchers, there are academics who look at policy on a much longer horizon of impact and have the tools to at least raise the red flags that might be there. So think as long as there is continuous dialogue and as long as we recognize that increasing the number of migrants who are not able to find a livelihood poses eventually a social risk of unrest or of increasing crime, law and order, or of failure of our health parameters as a nation, failure to protect our women and children. As these things are recognized, I expect that things will improve. And I see that, for example, in decentralization of projects, I already mentioned one, the push for rooftop solar will reduce the need for mega solar projects over time.
That's right. Yep, those are important points. And I was wondering if you have come across, of course, there are a lot of workshops and conferences and dialogues that are taking place across on climate change, renewable energy. Do you find discussions around the community aspect of RE growth? And do these discussions speak to policy? If you could talk about that.
So, I can think of several efforts by policymakers, and in a lot of the conferences that we go, social issues do get highlighted. For instance, I was at a conference on sustainability, rather than we don't really talk about RE in isolation, but I was in a sustainability conference at IIT Palakkad earlier this year. And among other speakers, we had a former lottery ticket seller who is now a TEDx speaker and runs a completely eco-conscious system out in Manesar. It's a sustainable golf course, but it gives employment to marginalized people. And it's looking at restoring ecosystems. I went to visit that golf course, and my golf cart almost ran into a Nilgai. And at night there were lapwings who'd owned the golf course, and if you went anywhere close to the nest, they would start twittering, did you do it? So it can be done. There is hope. I can think of many efforts by states. For example, the Chhattisgarh Biofuel Development Authority have created livelihoods for thousands of farmers and tribal resource collectors. And there is a cooperative called the Chhattisgarh Minor Forest Producers Federation. And they have tens of thousands of tribals who collect tribal produce, which is then sold to medicinal plant makers, chocolate makers, and livelihoods are created. In fact, that has actually reinforced traditional livelihoods rather than worked against them. So I was myself involved in one of these efforts. This Chhattisgarh Biofuel Development Authority helped us get a tree-borne oil from that region in Pendra Road, Pendra and Anuppur. And using the tree-borne oil at Dehradun, we made a jet fuel, a biojet fuel, and we flew a spice jet plane from Dehradun to Delhi. Then we flew an Air Force plane at the Republic Day fly past. Then we flew another plane, Air Force, at the world's highest airport in Leh. So, these eventually you have to build those partnerships. I was also privileged last year when I was able to visit the President of India, Honorable Srimati Draupadi Murmu, with a delegation. And you could see how empathetic she was to the needs of the marginalized. You also see the steps taken in various government ministries. The problem is that the scale of issues is so large that even if a few things get done, you tend to focus on what's not happened. I would say that we must encourage and also praise what has happened.
Chhattisgarh is a great example that you mentioned, but are there other examples that you may have come across of interventions made by policymakers or climate campaigners that you think it could be from India or any other part of the world that can be emulated?
In fact, Roli, there are dozens of initiatives, particularly the efforts made at the grassroots by district collectors and commissioners. They are the last mile. They connect the government to the people. And there are many of them whose names you will not see because they're just doing their job, but they're doing it very well. I saw a lot of that during the COVID lockdown. We built a little portal that was my own team when I was at CSIR, Indian Institute of Petroleum, and we were an autonomous body with the government, so we worked very closely with the government. I was looking after supply chains, and we foresaw a problem where migrants would go back to their villages, do the only thing they know well, which is farming, and then there'd be too much farm output and prices would collapse. So to protect that, we built a little portal. We called it Kisan Sabha. It was made available to farmers nationally. And the idea was that a farmer should have access to more than one mandi just by putting in their PIN code on a very simple phone-based app. They could see all the nearest mandis and the cost it would take to get a truck in real time to that mandi and the price at that mandi of every produce.
Right.
So it helped improve the decision making and realization. We thought we'd get 10,000 farmers. This was in 2020. Now we're in 2024. We have over 10 lakh farmers on the portal. Average farmer income has more than doubled. And it's not really talked about. It's not necessary to talk about it, but it has changed lives and one knows that it has made an impact, right? There are people who migrated back who we know from verbatim interactions. They will never come back to the cities again because they say that it's no longer necessary. So these are positive signs. I have also seen the work done by think tanks like the MS Swaminathan Foundation, TERI, the Energy and Resources Institute, Center for Science and Environment, Council on Energy, Environment and Water. These are all keepers of our consciousness. And as long as there are enough keepers of the consciousness, I think that there will be people who will make sure that the right things happen. Yeah.
Right. Such heartening examples, Dr. Ray. Really, like, we deal with so much in our reporting also, and in climate conversations, there's a lot of gloom and doom, as in not dismissing that, the gloom and doom scenario, but it's so important to highlight things that are working out, right? So it's been interesting hearing your thoughts on the growing complexities and also the solutions that have emerged on the ground and have worked well. So they seem to be coexisting. But what does the future of India's vulnerable communities look like to you? Yeah.
There's a little bit of a Robert Frost, the road not taken in that question, right? Because policies and actions taken today will have their impact 20 years from now. We don't know all of those. We don't know, for example, whether the simple concept of land use change, I put in a renewable energy project and the function of the land changes, what it will do to a community 20 years from now. But again, I can go back to my own experience. Back in 1999, I was trying to understand how the less fortunate in India lived. So I traveled with a minimal backpack for 200 kilometers, eating fruit from the trees, drinking water from the river, 200 kilometers, 14 days from Amarkantak to Mandla in eastern Madhya Pradesh. So if I found a village, I slept in the village. I was following the principles of the Narmada Parikrama, which goes back thousands of years. But this area was a tribal area. There were mostly Baigas in the area. And there are some parts of Dindori district that have soil and weather conditions that only enable cultivation of a few minor millets and a local oil seed. So you don't even get rice and dal. You don't get milk because nothing grazes. The soil, the water just goes through, even though it's near a river. There were places where a school teacher told me they had not had cow's milk for generations. But yet the same places have made progress in the last 25 years because India has invested in agricultural universities. We have the Krishi Vishwavidyalayas who have made meaningful interventions in crop science. They've disseminated cultivation practices, enabled tribals to look not only at cultivation but at forest produce as a means of livelihood. Even if we go to desertified areas, we have seen that there are new livelihood opportunities emerging, even in collection of biomass for renewable energy projects. The only thing is, like I said, the scale of the problem is very large. So there's no room for complacency. You have to keep building awareness, keep having dialogues, and you have to keep prodding the conscience of those who have to ensure that those who have not are supported equally well.
Truly well said. And I think this has been a great conversation, and I think I could go on speaking to you because there's so much to learn and so many ideas to exchange. It's been a pleasure having you, and thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. We are so truly grateful for your time, and we do hope there is a more inclusive climate future for all of us.
I hope so too. There are generations coming after us, and if it's not inclusive, at some point everything will fall apart. But we live in hope.
Wow, that was really interesting and a very informative episode indeed. Stay tuned to the Migration Story podcast. We have lots more coming your way. Thank you.
The Migration Story.